Underdown. I haven't seen you in, well, since before the election at least, and it's so
Yeah.
glad to get you back together with me. And I know you've been thinking about the Torbitt memorandum and some other things that are connected to it lately. So, with that in mind, the show I did on Tuesday, the Perm Index Connection, was really a lot about Torbitt and the possibility just the sneaking suspicion that I have that could McDuff have been the FBI leak to Torbitt, as recounted in Jim Mars's recollection of his interview with Torbitt? He said that his sources were uh, an FBI agent and somebody else, I think a ATF maybe. But who could that have been? Well, let's see what David thinks. David, how are you today?
I'm doing good, John. Thanks. Yeah, this topic is always very interesting for me, um, and as I was saying, since we last talked, I actually went to a wedding at the Plaza Hotel in New York City that had many of the characters in this drama were guests of the wedding, so that was really fun. But um, when you first proposed that, like I remember a couple years ago, we talked about the Torbit memo, and you and George Webb introduced it to me, and we talked about it a little bit, and I wasn't familiar with it at all. But I've tried to learn the different characters and reanalyze it now with new information, and that's what I was hoping we'd do today, was try to figure out who these potential Torbit memo leakers are. So we know that William Torbitt is the author, and that's a pseudonym, and that he was interviewed by a journalist named Jim Mars from Fort Worth, Texas, that was a later JFK researcher, author person. And we we know that Jim Mars thought the person's last name was Copeland, and that he was from Waco, and that he was a University of Texas law school alum. So those are the kind of the facts that we have, and so try to construct the network around those things is what is going to be fun to try to do today.
Yes, but also remember, I'm promising everybody Henry Kissinger too. So let's remember to save some time for Sir Henry um,
He's
toward the end, maybe.
he's easy to weave into the story.
All right. Well, let's start here. As you know, according to uh, the author, Permindex was comprised of four groups. And your proposal to me before the show is that whoever the leaker was had to be familiar with these four groups, or at least most of them. So to dig a little more deeply into these four groups, let's just name them. Number one, Solidarists, an Eastern European exile organization. Number two, the American Council of Christian Churches, led by Haroldson L. Hunt. Number three, the Free Cuba Committee, headed by Carlos Prio Socarras. And four, the Syndicate, headed by Clifford Jones, ex-lieutenant governor of Nevada. This group also included Bobby Baker, George Smathers, Roy Cohn, Fred Black, and Louis McWillie. So those are our four contestant categories, and let's dig in. So where would you like to start?
Well, the first thing I would do is I would challenge the four categories a little bit, because the Christian churches with H.L. Hunt, who was the Texas oilman guy that we all remember with the Sweet 8F, and Jesse Jones and the Houston oilmen and the John Birch Society and all those things. I feel like that group would be in the Bobby Baker, you know, the last group with the with Roy Cohn and all those guys, because that was so it was Bobby Baker, who was, for review, he was little LBJ. He was a staffer for LBJ. He was the one that ran the Quorum Club. He was the bagman for the Sweet 8F group, and the Quorum Club was the club in Washington, D.C., where they had the compromise operations going, where they had the hostesses and waitresses would hook up with the senators and they would blackmail them. The most famous being a woman named Ellen Romanovich, who was supposedly captured on film with not only JFK but also with Gerald Ford, and that compromise material was used by Bobby Baker and Sweet AF to blackmail Gerald Ford on the Warren Commission to give inside information on what was going on. So right away, I already think that the categories are conflated. So that's the first thing, and then the other part that that with the Perm Index and with Lewis Bloomfield, his connections are also with World Wildlife Fund. He's the Canadian head of World Wildlife Fund. So now you're immediately in with Prince Bernard, who is the founder of the Bilderberg. You also have Prince Philip, who is the prince, I don't know what his official title was. He's Elizabeth's husband. But you also have Julian Huxley in the mix. And Julian Huxley is the person that recruited Hermann Joseph Muller from Columbia's Fly Lab. They started the biology department at Rice University, which was started by James Baker's grandfather. So all these Texas oil men and the Rice group and the Houston people, this is the Colonel Edwin Mandel House group, because that's where, it goes back to the Civil War and the Confederate, Rhett Butler and the blockade running and all this stuff. This is where it goes back.
I just have to say, I completely agree with you without knowing the details you see. But what's been going on in my studies is I've been seeing a completely clear arc from Edwin Mandel House to Eleanor Roosevelt to all of the progressive movements that are generated, which really come from Philip Drew Administrator, the book in which he describes how, back in 1900 or so, how, not only does the United States need somebody, a great administrator, i.e. dictator, i.e. Edward Mandel House to run everything, but we also need to do something for the poor people. And that means that we're going to create settlement houses and Jane Addams and all of that stuff. Nobody thinks that all of these do-gooders are really the extension of the Confederate power and using these do-gooders to amass, voting blocks in the form of various victim organizations in order to sustain what really is the dark power that was behind the Confederacy in the first place. I'm thrilled to hear you saying this from the point of view of looking back from the Torbitt memorandum, and so let's break it down a little bit more in terms of not trying to go back all the way to the Civil War, because we'd be here for days.
Yeah.
But to just after making the point that this is, a valid analysis of where our progressive movement comes from. It's shocking if you're a dyed in the wool Woody Guthrie fan, but it's this land is your land is a nice idea, but I think in terms of progressive politics, it's the government's land to do with what they want. Anyway, I've got on a rant there. Let's go back to you.
That's fine. The other big point that I wanted to bring in with this Texas activity and with Edward Mandel House and his dad and their background with the Houston Plank Road and the railroad building in Texas, the geopolitical play at the time is connecting South and North America. And this is the Panama Canal story. This is the railroads. This is the Belt and Road, all these ideas. But with World War I, what was the big threat? Hindu-German conspiracy, German invasion from Mexico into Texas. Who's going to mitigate and meet that threat. It's the Houston, Texas people. So who are
Wait a
the
minute.
groups?
Hang on. You said Hindu?
Hindu-German conspiracy?
Yeah, I never heard of this.
Oh, that was the plot to invade Texas from Mexico, the Germans and the
But
Indians?
the Indians, the
Yeah,
people from Asia,
India.
India, were going
Yeah.
to invade from
This is where
Whoa.
our friend William Wiseman makes his bones. When William
What?
Wiseman is sent to the United States to run British intelligence as Edward Mandell House's assistant, he
Ooh.
busts the German Hindu conspiracy, and his proteges are Julius Klein, who becomes the mentor of Max Fisher, we're going to talk about later, and also he is he's the mentor of William Stevenson, who becomes the head of the British Security Coordination. And the other person that is in the mix on this British Hindu conspiracy, which was like the Zimmerman, it was a signal comm interception. And the other person that was involved in this is Thomas Masaryk, who was the future first president of Czechoslovakia. And he had an intelligence network from Europe. He moved to Chicago. He was working with the University of Chicago. He was meeting with our friend Robert Lansing, trying to get legitimacy and recognition for the nation of Czechoslovakia. So he was a spy also. So he has his protege, Edward Benesch, whose granddaughter becomes my mom's childhood friend, and her uncle, or her uncle is Zbigniew Brzezinski. Her aunt marries Zbigniew. So all these characters, and then the Joseph Korbel works for Benesch during World War II, also for the
Oh,
assassination of Reinhard Heydrich.
but
That
let
was
me stop you for a second. I'm still my jaw's still down from what you said. Did anybody really believe that Germany and the Hindus were going to invade the United States from Mexico? That sounds so far-fetched.
I don't know what they thought, but what I do know is that William Wiseman was also a banker for Kuhn and Loeb, and his boss was named Paul Warburg, and Paul
Mhm.
Warburg's brother, named Max Warburg, was the head of the Warburg Bank and also the mentor of Helmar Schlecht, and he was also the World War I intelligence chief for the Germans. So you've got the brother of the German intelligence and the the head of Kuhn and Loeb Bank, whose worker is running this English intelligence network in the United States in the period running into World War I under the Wilson administration. But you'd also made a point about the about Robert Lansing and how his his role being so critical, and he's the person that these guys are all interacting with. He's the Secretary of State. He wants to have this State Department, kind of a spy gang for
Security service, the diplomatic
armed
security service, the
armed
armed yeah,
diplomatic security services.
yeah, which becomes a kind of a private militia because it's
Yeah.
run from money that's off the books.
And you got to stay in shape by being on a bicycling team for the armed military games if you're a armed diplomatic services person. That's where that
You can't say Benassi anymore. Don't you know
no,
that?
you just got to say that you're a Dutch cyclist for the American team in your 50s, and that
Bravo.
you're just a incredible
Yeah.
athlete that is still at the top of their game.
Yeah, man. That's all you can say. I never even said that, did I?
Top of your game.
Top of their game, right? And so, gosh, when you throw out all of this stuff at me, I love it, but then I want to stop and go back and just dig a little deeper to make my own dots connect up here. But so let's go back to the Torbitt memorandum, and let me ask you. I mean, are you saying that this maybe overblown division of 4 is indication that the memorandum is deceptive? or are you just suggesting that, well, it's something to consider before we decide whether the memorandum contains genuine truth or not?
I think like when I look at something like the Torbitt memo, I look at like anything. I look at the information that it has, who the people are, and then I just vet it. I just do, I it doesn't make sense. Is that relationship logical? Are you leaving out a big, you know, piece of the picture, like something like, you know, I I don't know, like that George de Morenscheld, who I think of it like in the first category we talked about, the solidarists, right? What, like, if I was writing the Torbitt memo and I wanted to be more explicit and my purpose was understanding of the material as opposed to just sort of teasing and not explaining, I would say that the Russian solidarists, they were the White Russians. The White Russians were people that had royal Romanov ties, that were powerful, wealthy Russians that felt they got screwed in the Bolshevik Revolution. So they now are trying to claw back the assets that they believe were taken from them. And George de Morange,
As well as hide the ones that they took with them when they fled. And that's where I think our Texas connection
yes,
can help us when you talk about Schlumberger and Jean de
yeah.
Menil.
But how about this one, John? How about George de Morancel's dad and uncle were the directors of the Bronible company, which is
That's
Standard
right.
Oil of Russia, or Baku, Azerbaijan. It was the largest oil discovery geopolitically. It is a massive um, world asset that is helpful for your navy and your army and fueling a war machine. And where it is in the world, in the Belt and Road, it is a crown jewel asset. So this is what
Oh
we're
yeah.
talking about. It's important that it's framed that way, that why, it's not just, the Russians, they don't, they didn't like the royals because the, Romanov girls, they were riding
But,
around in too fancy of carriages with too many dolls, and the peasants, I mean, that's
this
not.
is the connection with Sullivan and Cromwell, because
Hmm.
William Nelson Cromwell organized the American version of the Russian Order of St. John,
Right.
which is, with the white crosses. And these are the former military people of Russia under Kolchak and the the royalists that got their ass handed to them by the Bolsheviks in the various different wars. So that,
But,
the
yeah.
connection to Sullivan and Cromwell is exactly how to see the money laundering, because
Hmm.
I mean, that's what they do.
Yeah.
They're as the professional money launderers of the 20th century. So
They're right. I mean, as far as the legal structuring and corporate structuring that you've talked about so much, yeah, they're one of the world leaders, and critical to know the characters involved, um and even like little things like Harlan Fiske Stone, and knowing that he was the law school professor at Columbia of FDR and Wild Bill Donovan, and that he was also a partner of Sullivan and Cromwell. So that there are these like bleed overs of relationships where it's
mhm.
not like, it's really hard to think of this stuff as the cowboys and the Indians, and there's the good guys and the bad guys, and I want to try to find the good guys and find all the bad guys, and there's crossover. All these characters have complicated relationships, and so that's you know a big but
Bobby Baker is running dark ops for LBJ.
right.
Roy Cohn is running dark ops for who? For Hoover? For whoever?
I think he's running them for Meyer Lansky, and I think
Okay.
he's running them for his childhood friend, Gene Pope's dad, who had the Colonial cement. Later on, it becomes known as the Fat Tony Salerno, cement trust. In that becomes the end of the five families in New York with the pizza connection. but the cement union with Fat Tony Salerno that Donald Trump, gets the special deals with because Roy Cohn knows Fat Tony. To me, that's the continuation of the old Gene Pope family connection. Now, Gene Pope, the son, started the National Enquirer with a loan from Frank Costello, who was the Genovese crime family head that Lucky Luciano ran. And Lucky was the one that, with Meyer Lansky, the same Meyer Lansky, they did Operation Underworld with Thomas Dewey. So that's where these groups are the same. But what I wanted to go back to was with the Baku and Bronnable, because I think it's so important. The person that negotiated that concession with the Rothschilds and the Noble family, which is the Alfred Noble, like the Nobel Prize and the dynamite and the explosives, all that stuff. It was Walter Teagle. Walter Teagle.
Wow, it was.
Yeah, Walter Teagle was the chairman of Standard Oil of New Jersey. Standard Oil of New Jersey was partnered with DuPont and General Motors for tetraethylene, and the person that Teagle merged with for that deal was a guy named William Stamps Farish. William Stamps Farish ran Humble Oil in Humble, Texas, with the Spindletop oil discovery, which was the beginning of the Texas oil boom. William Stamps Farish was also the person that was involved in the tetraethylene deal with General Motors and DuPont and with the Luftwaffe and Goring and all that. But and Teagle, whose dad was original Standard Oil partner with John D. Rockefeller I from Cleveland, they go way back. He was also on the board of directors of IG Chemi, the American IG Farben company with Edsel Ford, right, from the Ford Motor Company in Detroit, who is on the board of directors of the Detroit Aircraft Company that becomes Lockheed. And one of the partners of Detroit Aircraft Company, William Bushnell Stout, that did the Ford Trimotor plane that made the Josephine Ford plane that Richard Byrd flew to Antarctica, was named after Josephine Ford. He was also very good friends with the Ford family, and then of course his cousin is Harold David Dryhole Byrd, who is the LTV owner and owns the School Book Depository. LTV merges with Consolidated Airline, or with Consolidated, and becomes General Dynamics in Fort Worth.
LTV is what?
Ling, Teneo, and Vaught.
And that is what ultimately becomes General Dynamics.
Right. So Convair was, they did the B-24 with Rosie the Riveter and the Willow Run plant and the mile-long largest facility. That was Convair and Ford Motor Company. Charles Lindbergh is the advisor to Henry Ford and to Edsel Ford in this Willow Run facility in Ypsilanti, Michigan. They're making B-24 planes, which is a Convair plane. Their other factory is in Fort Worth, Texas. It's a Convair factory. So they make knockdown kits where they drive them, the Teamsters, Jimmy Hoffa's Teamsters, drive the knockdown kits to Fort Worth, Texas, where they assemble the completed B-24. That Fort Worth facility becomes the General Dynamics facility that I.B. Hale becomes the security director for. I.B. Hale's sons, who one of them kills John Connolly's daughter, if you remember, that he married, they're classmates of someone named Lee Harvey Oswald. And I.B. Hale's wife is the one that got Oswald the job at Yeager's photo place, and then it was the Bell Helicopter heiress that got him the job at the School Book Depository at Harold Dryhale Byrd, the cousin of Richard Byrd, who is related to the Byrd organization for all the Virginia, Ku Klux Klan, Southern racist students out there. Same Byrds.
Yeah, the West Virginia Byrds are distinguished themselves from the Texas Byrds, but it all goes back to the Virginia Byrds, and different wings of the same bird, so to speak. But I wanted to get back to my point, which was why would Meyer Lansky's bad dudes bad bad deeds dude Roy Cohn and Bobby Baker, who works for LBJ, would they be lumped together in this conspiracy, so to speak?
Well, they're running the Resorts International network, so they're doing what they've got the
They're doing that together?
who's that? Roy Cohn and Meyer Lansky?
No, Roy Cohn and Bobby Baker.
Bobby Baker he was involved in the Surview company. That was the parking meter, the parking meters in Cuba, and he was partnered with the guy who became Secretary of the Navy, whose daughter also got killed, like Connolly's daughter, when he was Secretary of the Navy. They were in that Surview parking meter business together. But Baker was like an old. He came from the Brown and Root cartel. Like, how there's the Herman Brown and George Brown, and they're the Texas Brown brothers, and you've got the Brown brother Harriman Brown brothers, and you got the Brown and Shipley, I'm trying to think where the Beatles are from. They're the Manchester, England Brown brothers, the Brown and Shipleys, and then you have this Brown, the Super Project Builder Browns, and they're Brown and Root, and then they become Kellogg, Root and Brown and Halliburton, and then Dick Cheney, merges them with Dresser, and Dresser is the company that George H.W. Bush started working for in Texas, and they're all owned by the Harriman, Yale, all this like same group that like a lot of, and the other thing that is like a big thing that stands out to me that is like always overlooked is like William Buckley. He was the
senior.
Well, the dad was doing the offshore oil deals with George de Mohrenscheld, was his oil scout, right? And then the son, they had the Sharon Statement. They started the Young Americans for Freedom, which was like the conservative group. And then 2 years later, they do the Port Huron Statement with Tom Hayden, and then the Students for Democratic. And that kicks up, and you have sort of the, left and right conservative YAF versus CDC, and you sort of create that Hegelian conflict that
the Yankee Cowboy War.
And they all make them in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Why do they make them all in Ann Arbor on Michigan's campus? Like, why are the Weather Underground from Ann Arbor?
Yeah. Well, maybe some of these connections you've been talking about might have something to do with that.
It's probably so you don't think about the Willow Run doing the Bomark missile system, which was the first surface-to-air missile. That's one thing. And then you don't want to look at Kaiser Fraser because they have a lot of intrigues as far as industrializing Israel after the 48 war, and that intrigue. And then also the Ford nuclear, and they call it the Phoenix program. They have a peaceful nuclear reactor, the Ford nuclear reactor. And that was part of the Atoms for Peace program. And that was a privately funded nuclear reactor on the campus of University of Michigan, brought to you by the Phoenix program, the good people of the Phoenix program.
Wow. I still have my American stamp collection with Atoms for Peace stamp from 1956.
They hired the best graphics for that stuff. I mean, I feel like all of that. I mean, I feel like all the space age and all that stuff. They really like made the. I mean, people were. I mean, they did the science fiction. They did all the stuff that people loved, all the space age stuff. And one of the major designers for that was Eero Saarinen, and he's of course, from Cranbrook, and his dad was the architect for the Cranbrook School, and he did like the St. Louis Arch, and he did the Dulles Airport, he did the St. James Embassy in London.
I think he did the National Art Gallery's second building, the extension.
He probably did. He did the JFK Airport in New York, and that actually that project is actually like the was sort of the futuristic airport, sort of the Jetsons airport, and he got a lot of praise for his design efforts for that JFK airport.
Now, let's go back to the Torbitt memorandum. You're analyzing it. You're deciding, whether to keep this part, to throw something out, to question the entire document, or what. But what I want to know is, what can we draw from the Torbitt document in terms of, first of all, is it worth our study, or do you think it's something that's probably just a throw that we shouldn't look at? But B, either way, the names, the connections that are recited in this very long memorandum are just as you say. I mean, all of them kind of set off alarm bells in different ways. So back to you on the Torbitt memorandum. What value does it have to study, for us to study that today? And do you actually think that somebody leaked this information to somebody that uses the pseudonym of Torbitt, or do you think it's all just a throw?
I think it's all related to Fletcher Prouty, and the reason I say that is,
Wow.
well,
Wow.
because the Torbitt memo is the continuation of the Torbitt memo is the JFK movie that's made by Oliver Stone, and the consultant that Stone used was Prouty, and Prouty
Yeah.
had the relationship at Yale where he was the ROTC leader, and he had a very strong relationship with Bill Buckley, as the Yale Daily News editor, and he also had a good relationship with George H.W. Bush. We also know that Godfrey Rockefeller, who was George Bush's friend from Andover and from Yale, was also there. And then also the McAuliffe that started AmeriCorps, that did the Operation Baby Lift. He was George H.W. Bush's roommate at Andover and at Yale. And
That
then
was
also,
we should just mention that the baby lift was taking children away from South Vietnam as
Mhm.
the South Vietnamese government was falling, and a very controversial idea. But you know,
the other person that was at Yale at that time was William Henry Draper III, and Draper's dad is the one that was the partner of Horace Rowland Gaither. They started the firm Gaither, Draper, and Anderson, and then his dad was General Wall Street. He would have been out there with he was out there with MacArthur in Japan doing the reconstruction of Japan after World War II. That's William Henry.
General Wall Street.
General Wall Street is the nickname of William Henry Draper Jr., the father
Okay.
of William Henry Draper III, who was friends with George H.W. Bush at Yale. And then his son is Tim Draper, and Tim Draper is the one that has Draper Jervison, the finance firm in Silicon Valley. And then his daughter's friend is the one that was friends with Elizabeth Holmes, that started Thermanos, and he was the initial investor in that. And then, of course, George Shultz, McDuff's rival, his grandson Tyler Shultz is the whistleblower for the Thermanos story, and his grandpa was one of the founders of that. We all know the George Shultz story, but when we have these whistleblower situation, those are the lenses that I look at it, where I'm like, well, geez, it's sure strange that the founder of the G6, George Shultz, who was at the I think he was the director of the Booth School of Business at University of Chicago. I feel like the Chicago boys and Milton Friedman and Paul Samuelson and all that, like, sure seems like Donald Rumsfeld was a University of Chicago boy student at one point as well. So I don't know. That's why when I look at these memos, I'm like, gosh, George Shultz created the Nuclear Threat Initiative also with Kissinger and with William Perry and with Sam Nunn, that did the Nunn-Lugar Act. So that's why there are a lot of insiders. But the thing that is really left out is, I feel like, the explanation of who the Chicago outfit is and who the characters of the Chicago outfit. And also Albert Jenner is somebody that I feel like has to be included in all these conversations, because he had the legitimacy of being a lawyer a director of General Dynamics. He was assigned to be on the Warren Commission. He investigated Oswald and Ruby for the Warren Commission. He was in charge of the King and Bobby Kennedy assassinations. And he was also a director of the General Dynamics Corporation and close friends with Lester and Henry Crown. And it's also very important to remember that Lester Crowns was married to G. David Shine's sister. G. David Shine was the assistant on the Army McCarthy hearings with Roy Cohn and was supposedly the boyfriend of Roy Cohn during those hearings. And it's also important to remember that Robert F. Kennedy, before he was Attorney General, was also on those groups. So it's important to look at the history of the Cohn family and the Kennedy family because they have a long history together.
Well, as you know, the first book that I read on my show was The Secret Team by Fletcher Prouty, and I've read it many times, and going back to it many times. And the question is, is Fletcher Prouty reliable? And I think he is.
Mm-hmm.
And so now you're suggesting that he might be the leaker that allowed Torbitt to put together this memorandum. And it's he saw it all. He flew Roosevelt around. He flew
Mm-hmm.
Chiang Kai-shek. He was Chiang Kai-shek's personal pilot. If he was Chiang Kai-shek's personal pilot, he knew all about the opium. He knew all about the financing of secret ops by the opium dealers and Air America, and all of that stuff was. I mean, he was at a level where he would have seen it and lived it, and perhaps was motivated to try to put a stop to it.
I feel like Fletcher Prouty's talks that he does, he is great. I love listening to he has a lot of excellent insights, and again, like but I also look at things like he grew up in Springfield, Massachusetts. His childhood friend is Creighton Abrams, right? So what I didn't tell is, since we last did a show, we went to New York City for a wedding, and we did a side trip, and this is going to be great because so we, after the wedding in New York City, which was at the Plaza Hotel, and I do think it was a black and white ball theme party. They didn't say that, but it was sort of a Venetian ball theme, and that the Plaza Hotel is where Truman Capote had the re-coming out party for our friend Kay Graham after Phil Graham commit suicide after the whole, Mary Pinochet Meyer, got drunk and started talking about that, and then he was the head of ComSat for JFK, and then he ends up dead. To reintroduce her to society, they have this black and white ball in New York. And Truman.
And what is a black and white ball?
It's a Venetian mask ball, and Truman Capote is.
Do they all wear black and white, or can they wear colors?
You can look at the pictures. I'll tell you, the star of it was Des Fitzgerald's daughters. They were young, and they were like and the one daughter, Penelope Tree or whatever, she was the model. And then the other one was the friend of Daniel Ellsberg that was in Vietnam with him in Lansdale. And then she goes back and meets Kissinger to say how she thinks Vietnam is a problem right before the Pentagon Papers release. So yeah, at that wedding, we sat across from a woman that we knew for a long time because her daughter went to camp with my sister, and they like played sports and everything against each other. And she was a minister, and she has done the baptisms for, she said, almost every single one of Hank the Deuce's grandkids in Grosse Pointe. And they're really good friends, and she wanted me to get together with one of the four that I know that used to come into our dry cleaner or whatever, and like talk about the family connections, because she said he doesn't know a lot of these things. And like, he walks by my house, he lives in my neighborhood, and like, I know his wife too, and they like walk by, and like, I look at them, I'm like, I cannot believe that it's like that's with all the layers of the stuff we talked about with the Willow Run and the Fords and the even Ann Arbor creating the PBS was started in educational broadcasting was originally in Ann Arbor before they made PBS. I mean, there's so many things. The Rand Corporation was was originally Ford Foundation money. It's like all these things were like coming together. So anyway, that was and the bride, by the way, her aunt, who's my mom's really close friend, is the one that told the story about when she was at Liggett, which is the private school in Grosse Pointe, when they would talk about the Ford family in the history class. Josephine, not the one they named the Admiral Byrd's plane, the trimotor after, but the daughter, she used to put her head down on the desk and just like not like, so that was like the kind of the Ford connections. And then her husband, who was a Crowley, which is the department store rivals of Hudson's and in Detroit and Kearns, he was boarding school classmates with Benson Ford. So they are like really close with all the Ford. So all these things are like really complicated for me because, as I've said on this before, my great grandma is the one that blamed Henry Ford by name for the death of my great grandfather and that. So that is why it's like very personal for me. But the second part of the trip that I want to talk about, which relates to your dad, is we went to West Point after. And so we went up to West Point, and my parents stayed in the Thayer Hotel, which is the old beautiful hotel at West Point, which is the U.S. Military Academy for people that don't know. And they stayed in the Creighton Abrams room. They named the rooms after all the people. So Creighton Abrams was the childhood friend of Fletcher Prouty. They named the I.G. Farben building the Creighton Abrams Center. Do you know that?
What I.G. Farben building?
In Frankfurt, Germany.
They named it. Who named it that?
Farben headquarters after 60s, I think, because Eisenhower was the head of NATO. They ran NATO out of the I.G. Farben building, and then they later named it the Creighton Abrams building. And then Abrams then later goes to, Vietnam for the Phoenix program, and that was like when Prouty talks about first going to Camp Pine Knot or whatever when he was first enlisted to be a cavalry officer. He said he knew Creighton Abrams there because he was from Springfield and he knew him from Massachusetts growing up. So I don't know that, this is the spy business. So there's going to be, people have complicated relationships. But the thing that I think about too is what Mr. X in that JFK movie, what he that famous scene with Donald Sutherland where he's
Donald Sutherland, my man.
This is a great scene. It's a great movie. And like, but he talks about like the, what was gained by killing Kennedy? Like what did they, who, number one, who did it? But number two, what do you get? Because if you kill a head of state, especially someone that's a, young and vibrant and, beautiful wife and family and like kind of this American dream sort of like playing out Camelot idea and then killing that person like horrifically in front of the world, creating I know the psychology in this is you want to mass traumatize the world and then you can offer the BS, Warren report because everyone's traumatized and they're thinking about, John saluting his dad and how, great of a moment that, was for people. I mean, where it's just like an unbelievable moment. Like, but what did they want? And what I think they wanted was they wanted aid and they wanted diplomatic cover for covert activity under humanitarian aid and USAID. I think that was the prize that Kissinger wanted.
We haven't talked about Kissinger yet, so let's bring him in and back. But before we do, as you know, I was speculating yesterday that I wonder if my dad could have been that FBI agent, unnamed person who was one of the sources that Torbitt acknowledged to Jim Mars. And I do have a lot of respect, and I think Jim Mars is a reliable source. I really do. And so, first of all, when my dad gets to SACSA in 1962, he's one of the first people drafted for SACSA. Also drafted for SACSA is Fletcher Prouty at a higher level, maybe 2 layers above if you look at the org chart, where my dad was. But it was a very small organization, just a few guys, and they would have known each other. So it's very likely that Fletcher Prouty and my dad had similar feelings about what was going on, and under their nose. I mean, my dad was privy to everything that J. Edgar Hoover wanted him to analyze, and that was a lot. So I think what I'm considering is that, maybe well, just to rattle off some connections. First of all, my dad always put me up to Lionel trains, connected to Lionel. Okay, my dad always bought Ramblers or AMC cars, and I got pictures of us with our Rambler station wagon when we were 6 years old. And now it's also the case that he was, connected at a high level with J. Edgar Hoover, who was in fact using the Nazis, the paperclip Nazis, to spy in America on his opponents. And so a number of these indications, maybe not enough to be persuasive, but still, the fact that my dad and Fletcher Prouty worked in the same office for a year or two, I think is really interesting. So I'm still putting my case together, but
Yeah.
it's
One thing I want to add to,
why, but first of all, why was my dad killed?
well, the one connection to that, I think, just for like laying the groundwork for this, Fletcher Prouty had the background of Air Force, which was a new division that was created in the National Security Act. And the first director of Air Force is Stuart Symington. Symington has very public feuds with Forrestal. And Forrestal, of course, becomes the first Secretary of Defense and then meets the death by falling out a window ending as well. So, and then the other person that's in Air Force early, and it's also important to remember, Symington's family has Gibson Island, is named after the Symington family that starts that, and the other major character in the Air Force early history is Harold Talbot, and Harold Talbot is the third Air Force secretary. He's the uncle of Strobe Talbot. But on their family property in Dayton, Ohio, they did the Runnymede Project, which was the Dayton Project. They were doing plutonium pits for the atomic bomb for Manhattan Project. And the director of that was a guy named Charles Allen Thomas, who was the brother-in-law of Strobe Talbot's uncle. Charles Allen Thomas was the scientific director of Monsanto Corporation, but he also worked with Charles Kettering of Ford and Delco, and he was one of the directors of the Ethyl Corporation. Ethyl Corporation made tetraethylene fuel that was the no-knock fuel that was used for aviation and controversially was brokered to the Nazis during World War II with the Luftwaffe. The corporations that were the patent holders of that process was DuPont Corporation, which was a part of General Motors at that time, and then they also dealt. The Ethyl Corporation was a subsidiary of General Motors and DuPont. And then you also have to remember that General Motors and Ford Motor Company have both made major investments in the same period with Opel Corporation, which is the largest automaker in Europe. And then they also have Opel Rack, which was the first rocket business in the world, was Opel Rack with Fritz von Opel, and he starts the rocketry clubs and all of the Jules Werner and the sci-fi, and inspires a young Werner von Braun as a little kid, and all that stuff. Dornberger worked for Opel Rack. He later becomes the head of Bell Helicopter. Prouty name drops him as the world leading engineer in helicopter aviation, Walter Dornberger. And you also have Henry Ford creating the Ford work in Cologne. And the person he worked with was Conrad Adenauer. And you talked. I was very interested hearing what Harley Schlanger had to say about Konrad Adenauer on your last show with his role. And then the thing that again is like super important with Konrad Adenauer, he not only negotiated with Henry Ford to put the Cologne factory, he's also the one that did the Holocaust reparations with Natum Goldman, who was the founder of World Jewish Congress. They met for that, and then he was also the person that met with our buddy, not Earl Cabal, his brother, Charles Cabal, that met with Richard Bissell, and they flew to Cologne, and they met with Konrad Adenauer, and they're like, we're going to put U-2 bases in Germany. And then a couple of years later, Gary Powers is shot down. Now you have an international incident of a spy plane, and that's said before, Lockheed was Detroit Aircraft Corporation for a very short time, but it was, and the directors of it were Henry Ford, Edsel Ford, Charles Kettering, William Bushnell Stout, and Alex Dow, the man that hired my great-grandfather. And they were neighbors and friends, and Alex Dow was the man that introduced Henry Ford to Thomas Edison in 1898 when Ford decided he was going to go into the automobile business. And that was the sort of the beginning of the Ford Motor Company story. Involves this Alex Dow, who was the the president of the Detroit Edison Company. So all of these intrigues with the science conferences coming to the University of Michigan, with the Manhattan Project people meeting in the 30s in Ann Arbor for these scientific conferences. I mean, it's going to be the Detroit Edison person. Willow Run was the largest factory in the world. The person doing the electrical for it is going to be Detroit Edison. Willow Run, the River Rouge plant, the electrical is all going to be Edison. So there's going to be very old relationships there. So that's also part of why the Ann Arbor story is so interesting to me. And that doesn't even get into the Henry Ford Dearborn Independent protocols of Zion, all this stuff that is packed in. I mean, when you say the word Henry Ford, you are packing in the number one. He and Lindbergh are the two number one American icons that become anti-Semites, and maybe Coughlin, as the number three.
I suspect the whole thing as being just provocateurs, trying to provoke people to get mad. But that's a big subject in itself, and I want to complete our mission today by bringing Henry Kissinger in to the story. So from the Torbitt Memorandum to Henry Kissinger.
So so Kissinger is important because he has the unbelievable positioning as a young man, where he is the translator for Allen Dulles as a young man. And so that in itself is like, I mean, like a lot of these stories, I always think there's no interview where you see the ad for Allen Dulles' translator assistant, like, oh, I'm gonna apply for that and knock out the interview and get hired. Like there is like a inside arrangement when that happens.
That's what happened to my dad. Just to put that in there, my dad was picked in advance. There was no civil service competition. It was like, this is the guy that the president wants, and so put him in there.
So the other thing with that is the Groton connection, with the Loomis being by Groton, because that's where you have Electric Boat. Electric Boat was making the submarines at the Fore shipyard, which was a Bethlehem Steel, but the person running that was Joe Kennedy in World War I, and that's where he meets FDR, who's the Assistant Secretary of the Navy at that point. So they're like, and that was the Electric Boat was making submarines at the Fore yard, and then Electric Boat becomes General Dynamics. So you have all these interests, and then of course Joe Kennedy is also the Merchandise Mart in Chicago. The Merchandise Mart is where JFK was going. Like all these crossovers with perm index and all that stuff is like, I feel like we're like, this is why the subject is really hard, is because it's like there's so many like loose ends and stuff that it's hard to lock in. But with Kissinger and where the shows that you've been doing with the sleeper agent come in, which are really interesting, is his role at Camp King in Germany starting in 1946. And Camp King is interesting because this is where the denazification is taking place. So they're taking the officers, and they've got Sidney Gottlieb there, and they're bringing in all the characters, and everybody's there. And Kissinger's, is he sharing a bunk with Reinhard Gehlen? I don't know. I mean, are they in the same, cabin together, or, across the way? I'm not sure, but they're both there. And then, of course, Gehlen organization becomes the BND. The BND and the CIA take up Crypto AG, which is the, encryption thing that started with the Bronnable people. The Noble family was the original, after they sold out at the right time, of the Bronnable company, and they got into the explosives, and they got into the cryptography game, and they just happened to, pick this machine that was unbreakable, and that became the Crypto AG machine. And that was the BND and the CIA and Henry Kissinger were all involved in that deal, and that became like with like Reagan, with the bombing of Libya, with the disco. Remember, they bombed the disco in Germany, and then Reagan bombs because of that. The information from that interception was Crypto AG. So that's another linkage between sort of intelligence and signal comms, and using these denazification techniques with Eric Traub and Sidney Gottlieb and all these guys that are at this Camp King, which just sounds crazy that they're, but
Yeah, Gottlieb, what is he doing there other than supervising the torture? I mean, interrogations.
he's also on the YouTube program. They tuck him in the YouTube program. So
Wow.
again, it's like, I mean, everybody loves the Area 54 or 51 and the, UFOs and all that stuff. Well, number one, Lockheed Skunk Works is there. Number two, the people that put it there is Alan Dulles and Richard Bissell. So again, it's information, but is it, gray men and spaceships, or is it, Alan Dulles and Richard Bissell creating a rabbit hole for people?
Yeah, and poor old Bill Clinton couldn't even go there. He said, "Oh well, I'm the president, but there's some places I just can't go."
Didn't
Um,
didn't
David, I think we're going to give the Torbitt memo a pass. I think from what you've been saying and my own analysis, I think that it passes the smell test and has perhaps a little bit obscure information, but leads such as you've talked about that are worth following. And so I'm going to keep believing in the Torbitt memo and further investigating what McDuff's role might have been in exposing the bad guys, the cabal behind the assassination of JFK. What an interesting story.
Yeah, I think it's great. It's a great story, and it's really personal for both of us, and
Yeah.
it is really I'm very grateful that we can talk about this stuff and try to figure out, because this is all classified secret programs, so putting it together is very, you have to really have a lot of
It's
background information, and most people you communicate with have none of the background, so it's just nonsensical to them. And so it's a process, and I'm just grateful that we can talk, and hopefully people will listen to this and take the information and
yeah.
help use it.
Pass it around. And folks, follow David Cranmer Underdown on Twitter. He's always dropping amazing connections, and I really enjoy following his feed. And David, will you come back and let's flesh out your ideas about the sleeper agent and how
Yeah,
that book connects to all of your work? I think
definitely.
that's going to be fascinating. And Adam Finnegan has done an amazing job, and we
Hmm.
haven't been able to break through the the glass ceiling of genuine medical expertise. If you even the ones that are like I would think that somebody like Robert Malone or McCulloch or the McKernan, all of them would be fascinated with this book. But for some reason that they're just not letting themselves indulge in what I think is the key to a lot of our health problems today. The biowarfare of the early 20th century, and then bringing that up to date. I'm looking forward to it, David.
Yeah. And
Come on back soon.
one last thing too is that just like on the in the spirit of just like interest and good stories, like the whole the whole idea of Hermann Joseph Muller bringing James Watson to Bloomington, Indiana, after winning the Nobel Prize for an irradiated fruit fly, like, is that the bat or the Spider-Man story? Is the irradiated spider? Is that the backstory? I don't know. I feel like the radiated fruit flies, the genetics, the first head of the Human Genome Project is interesting for people like Malone and you know the people that worked
Well,
at Salk Institute, and I mean the history of Salk Institute is the same families. I mean it's the same. I mean Jonas Salk was at University of Michigan. He was a Park Davis employee. He was at Pittsburgh. Like I mean before he went to San Diego. Like these are the characters. So I mean I don't know. I do feel like hopefully it's helpful to people. I don't know what to say. I feel like the characters are really good, and I feel like the intrigues are amazing for all these, high.
Well, you mentioned radiating fruit flies becoming one of the major important tasks of our scientific community in the 20th century through this Herman Muller guy. But then what is Judith Vary Baker doing in New Orleans with Dr. Oshner?
Yeah,
They're radiating monkey viruses to make them more deadly so that they can use them as assassination weapons. And that turns out to have been SV40 getting radiated over and over again to enhance its lethality. And that, of course, goes right into the McDuff story and right into my own personal health. So,
and
my goodness, this is
and
fascinating. And
and is the
you
theme that I've said from the beginning that the Mary Sherman, her life is parallel to my grandma. Exactly, sounds exactly like her life as far as being friends with the elites of Chicago. My grandma was from Ohio, but was in Bloomfield Hills. But she was the one that would have been friends with the Lindberghs and all the Boots and all these, people at Cranbrook and stuff. She was the one that was friends with all of them. So, she got the fast cancer when my dad was a freshman in college. So I don't know. It sure rings to me. But
what year did she die?
66.
Okay, yeah, that's right in the alley when they were doing this.
She was a chemist for the Michigan hospitals, and so did she work with Jonas Salk? Did she work with Thomas Francis at University of Michigan? I know she was very close friends with the chief chemist of Park Davis Pharmaceutical. He was the one that fixed up my parents, and he was also the person on the Kresge Hooker Library with what's his name, the Neil Gordon, the founder of the Gibson Island Gordon Research Conferences in Gibson Island. He was the chemist at Wayne State University, and Harvey Merker was the assistant with him. And that was another person, I mean, that was on my dad's paper route. They were the next door neighbor of Father Coughlin. Like literally that was the paper route. So this is why these connections are like, I mean, I feel like I get a hard time from people sometimes as far as like, well, what you do, like, we can't get an indictment from this, or, what you're doing isn't, it's just a distraction and a waste of time. Well, don't read it. If you don't think it's that good, then find what you like, you know?
Give everybody your was it your grandmother or your great grandmother's name? It was
Her name was Jeanette Erskine Cranmer Underdown.
okay.
And
All
she was
right.
the one whose mom was the pioneering double mastectomy that killed herself because she was beautiful and vain, and her husband was the doctor from Steubenville, Ohio, that had the son, his father, his grandfather, all Michigan medical school, going back to the 19th century in Ann Arbor. And of course, Bob Muller's grandpa was also a Michigan doctor from Pittsburgh, just up the river from Steubenville, Ohio. So Bob Muller, I always think of that whenever I think of you and Oleg Deripaska.
David Cranmer Underdown. What an amazing conversation this has been. Thank you very much. Thanks everybody, and I will see you guys tomorrow with Marcia for our weekly wrap up. Bye now.